Hello and welcome back to the Movie Memo Recaps. Today we are going to recap a 2025 movie titled Ad Vitam. Please be advised that there will be spoilers ahead. The movie opens in France, with Frank, a quality control inspector for high-rise structures. The following day, Frank and his wife, Leo, went to the hospital for a pregnancy visit. Apparently, Leo is 8 months pregnant, with only a few days till her due date. When they return home from the hospital, they are shocked to discover their apartment in complete chaos, as if someone had purposely destroyed it in search of something. Frank then meets with his best friend, Ben. During their talk, it is revealed that the people who ransacked Frank's flat were looking for a key he had hidden away. Several days later, while Frank and a colleague were working, he nearly fell from the structure. He spots a suspicious figure hurrying down the structure. Frank instantly follows and pursues the man, but the bald stranger flees. Frank rushes home, concerned since he hasn't heard from Leo all day. When Frank arrives, he is relieved to find Leo safe and sound. Meanwhile, a white-haired man enters a waiting automobile. Inside the truck is the same bald man who had previously escaped from Frank. Moments after, the white-haired man brutally kills the bald man. That night, after Leo has fallen asleep, Frank stealthily goes to the rooftop of their apartment building to check on the concealed key. The key's purpose remains unknown, but one thing is certain. It's extremely valuable, and Frank is determined to keep it out of the wrong hands. Frank is in the midst of moving the key's hiding place inside a sink when Leo unexpectedly appears. She confronts him, asking why he has been so agitated recently and why he has been spending nights on the rooftop rather than sleeping near her. Just as Leo demands to know what Frank is keeping from her, an unexpected knock on the door startles them. At the same moment, masked assailants broke into their residence, forcing their way in. The way Frank and Leo fight back reveals that they are no average couple. Despite their best efforts, they are eventually overwhelmed by the sheer number of invaders. After tying Frank up, one of the masked men holds a gun on his hand to get his fingerprints. The white-haired man from before, who had killed his own failing subordinate, turns out to be the mastermind of this attack. The man was revealed to be Van Nuken, a violent mercenary hired to get the key from Frank. Because Frank refuses to hand over the key, Van Nuken hacks Frank's phone and unlocks it. Before incapacitating him, Van Nuken instructs his men to sedate Leo and transport her away. The scene then shifts 10 years before, with a group of recently graduated elite Gigan officers greeting their families and senior colleagues. Among these policemen are Frank and Leo, who are not yet in a relationship. At that point, Frank stands out as one of his class's top graduates. Frank meets Nico, one of his fellow graduates, and his wife, before being approached by his boss, Astro. At that point, Astro hands Frank a badge with the inscription Ad Vitam on the back, which formerly belonged to Frank's father during his service. 2 years later, during the recruiting of new Gigan elite soldiers, Ben takes a series of examinations to become an officer like Frank. In the last exam, Ben is supposed to shoot a target placed on the chest of a senior, Frank. Fortunately, Ben hits the mark exactly, earning him the title of top graduate of the elite forces that year. Leo joins Ben, who isn't particularly close to his peers, for the graduation celebration. Apparently, Leo recognizes that Ben's immigrant status may make it harder for him to connect with others. When Frank notices Ben finally socializing with his pals, he seizes the chance to approach Leo, concerned that she would develop emotions for Ben. Frank quickly admits that he has affections for her. To his amazement, Leo discloses that she has liked Frank for 2 years, and their chat concludes romantically in a toilet. However, just as the romantic moment is about to begin, Ben, severely intoxicated and on the verge of puking, storms into the lavatory. Later that night, as Frank heads home with Nico and his wife, Manon, Nico teases him by wondering if he and Leo will spend the night together. Frank and Leo's relationship formally begins on that day, and Ben, Nico, and Manon enthusiastically welcome them. A week later, following a training session, Frank gets a call from Eric, a room attendant at the Trinon Hotel. Eric reveals hearing gunshots from one of the rooms. Based on this information, Frank hurries to the hotel with Nico and Ben. As they acquire information from the hotel management, 2 suspects assault them, shooting both Ben and Nico. After subduing the intruders, Frank quickly attends to Nico, who is gravely injured. Unfortunately, Nico succumbs to his injuries and dies. The following day, Frank is chastised by his boss, Astro, for acting recklessly without waiting for orders, resulting in 2 cops being shot, one of whom unfortunately died. Astro feels forced to ask Franck to resign from their unit as a result of his behavior. After taking one last look at his father's photo at the headquarters, Franck goes to the locker room to collect his belongings. The next day, after Nico's burial, Franck notices Leo having a serious chat with their superior, Astro. After seeing Nico's tragic death, Leo decides to leave the Gigan as well. Later, Franck pays a visit to Ben, who is still recovering from his injuries. While there, they stumble across a social media post that claims the shooters at the Trinan Hotel were ex-special forces. However, the assertion is immediately discarded for lack of evidence. Hearing this, Ben tells Franck to keep out of the situation. It has also been discovered that Ben's injuries are serious enough to keep him from performing physically demanding work. They wanted to relocate him to an administrative position, but he eventually decided to resign. Learning the truth only exacerbates Franck's guilt. One evening, while eating dinner at a restaurant, Leo tells Franck that she is pregnant. To prepare for the baby's arrival, Leo and Franck decide to relocate to a larger apartment. While packing their belongings, he stumbles upon his badge, stained with one of the shooter's blood from the Trinan Hotel incident. Franck, who was curious about the shooter's identity, requested a buddy, a police forensic doctor, to analyze the DNA. Later, Franck meets with Ben and informs him that one of the gunmen is a former Special Forces operative named Salim. Because Salim is known to work with the Directorate of Security and coordinate with numerous government ministries, Franck suspects that the tourist discovered dead at the hotel was not an ordinary guest. Once again, Ben tells Franck to keep out of the situation. Franck follows Ben's advice and saves the information about Salim in a locker and hides the locker key on the rooftop of his flat. This revelation finally exposes the truth. Franck has been hiding the key to that locker all along. Some years later, unable to contain his desire to unearth the suspected conspiracy behind the Trinan case, Franck meets with a journalist to discuss it. He insists on keeping his identity private. After striking an arrangement, Franck agrees to turn over the evidence he's collected. Later, at the ministry's office, the head of the Directorate of Security meets with the minister. During their talk, they reveal that 7 months ago, Colonel John Brennan, a former American officer who now works for the CIA, arrived in France with a security detail to arrange a weapons sale with Australia. 2 staff members went inside John's hotel room that day to gather some essential documents. However, the plan was thwarted when John and his guard came suddenly to the room, prompting Salim and his accomplice to shoot them. Not only that, but they also discover that a former Gigan operator named Franck has proof accusing the Directorate of Security after studying the bloodstain left by Salim on his badge. Franck learned this information from a journalist who works for the same media outlet as the reporter he approached. The minister understands that if this material reaches the CIA, it will seriously strain diplomatic relations between France and the United States. As a result, she tells the 2 men before her to recover Franck's evidence and then kill him in order to silence any witnesses. In the present, after Van Naken successfully kidnaps Leo, Franck, who has recently recovered consciousness, receives a call from Van Naken, who reveals to him his wife's condition. During the call, Van Naken demands Franck deliver over the hidden proof within 4 hours, or he will kill Leo. Before concluding the call, Van Naken tells Franck that involving the police would be pointless. Franck was framed as a fugitive after Van Naken used his fingerprint, taken from a weapon, to blame him for the murders of Van Naken's men. Franck quickly cleans himself up and heads to his apartment to get the key he had concealed in the bathroom sink. However, as he reaches the apartment, he is surprised to see several police officers stationed inside. When Franck goes to fetch the key, he is surprised to find that it is no longer there. An officer discovers him moments later, forcing Franck to struggle his way out and flee. After successfully dodging the authorities, Franck rushes to Ben's job and tells all that has occurred. When Ben realizes that the locker key is gone and Franck requires the bloodstained Gigan badge, he brings Franck to his house and gives him his own. Franck smears his blood on the badge, hoping to deceive Van Naken's group and use it as leverage to free Leo. Shortly after, Franck and Ben arrived at a rendezvous spot deep in the forest. To avoid detection, Ben carefully stepped back before arriving at the destination and surreptitiously installed a tracking device on Franck. When Franck arrived at Van Naken's lair, he was promptly restrained, with his arms chained by his henchmen. When Franck finally confronted Van Naken, he took Franck's phone and brought him to Leo, who was being held captive in the wilderness. After acquiring the bloodstained badge he had been looking for, Van Naken directed his men to turn on Franck's phone. He then directed them to send a message to all of Franck's connections, threatening to harm his wife and child if Franck did not cooperate. They designed the message to give the idea that Franck had killed Leo before doing the unspeakable. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Van Naken, the police, who were already searching for Franck, received a notification from the phone's enabled GPS. With his plan in place, Van Naken left the area, leaving 3 of his men to execute Franck and Leo. Ben emerged, wearing a mask, just when the situation appeared grim, and rescued them. Franck, Leo, and Ben hurriedly hijacked a car and drove away, frantic to flee. A frantic chase began, interrupted by sounds of gunfire. During the pandemonium, a bullet struck Leo and seriously injured her arm. As Franck ministered to her wound, attempting to stem the bleeding, Leo's water burst, indicating that she was in labor. Franck saw this and pushed Ben to take Leo to the hospital before leaping out of the car to slow down Van Naken's men, who were hot on their heel. In the midst of a heated battle with Franck, Van Naken directed his troops to continue pursuing Ben's automobile. Franck attempted to flee on a stolen Forest Ranger motorcycle, but Van Naken pursued him from behind. Inside the car, Ben noticed Leo become more pale and unresponsive. He attempted to keep her conscious by chatting to her, but her health deteriorated swiftly. Meanwhile, Van Naken's men continued to pursue and close in on them. To make matters worse, Franck was being pursued not just by Van Naken, but also by the police. In a bold move, Franck stole a paramotor from a farmer and escaped once more, this time flying. While airborne, Franck called Ben to inquire about Leo's health. It was obvious that Leo was fading quickly, falling in and out of consciousness. After the call, it became clear that Ben had suffered terrible injuries, with his body beaten and bleeding. Elsewhere, Astro, Franck, and Ben's former boss received a call directing him to put an end to his former subordinate's escape. Astro instantly organized his squad to intervene. Ben, still chased by Van Naken's men, tried everything he could to get to the hospital, aided by Franck from above who led him along shortcuts. Van Naken emerged as Ben was pulling into the hospital parking lot, waving a gun at him. Fortunately, Franck came right on time. As he was about to finish off Van Naken, his former superior, Astro, emerged unexpectedly, surrounded by a team of troops. Despite the risk of getting shot, Franck raced into the car to take his dying wife to the hospital. After Leo received medical attention from the medics, Astro arrested Franck to make him accountable for his alleged acts, which included the murder of Van Naken's men. 1 month later, Franck was visibly moved when Leo and their newborn child came to see him. Leo disclosed in that poignant moment that she had indeed found the key Franck had concealed during the battle against Van Naken's army. Leo had already submitted the evidence to the government a few days previously. The government acquitted Franck on all charges, describing his acts as self-defense. He was likewise cleared of any responsibility for the killings of Van Naken's men. In the film's last scene, Franck and Leo embrace. Ben, who had fully recovered, smiled as he watched them from a distance, happy to see their joy. Thanks for watching. If you are new, don't forget to subscribe for more of these recaps. Until next time, have a nice day.